Hi, this is Joe Hage. I have the privilege of leading your medical devices group, which, as of this recording, has more than 300,000 members worldwide. And Gary Sainer, our famed blue shirt presenter, is no small part of that. This is ReedTech's 6th webinar on unique device identification. And frankly, the reason we've done it so many times is we consistently get hundreds of people coming. This is a complex topic, and it is a mandatory topic for anyone who chooses to market medical devices in the United States. Gary, hello?
Gary's here.
You know the routine. I will mute myself. It's your show, and I'll be back with questions at the end. Take it away.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Joe, for once again setting up this conference and session so that we can discuss the UDI. There's a number of activities going on surrounding UDI, and there's a couple years of experience now that Class 2 manufacturers would need to consider as they start to put their submissions and plans in place. I'm now going to just a second show my screen, and Joe, if you would confirm that you now see the title slide.
You are confirmed, sir.
Okay, great. That's what I would like. So let me do a quick check down through here. We're going to cover a number of slides today, confirming this is the version that we want to look at. And sure enough, it is. Okay, good. All right, so a couple things that we'd like to do to get started, cover a little bit of the background and objectives of the session today. As you know, many of you are Class 2 manufacturers, and you now see a date of September 24th, less than a year, to have UDI marked on your product and to have a submission to the FDA GUDID. So there's time is marching. There's a lot of things to do, a number of things to take care of in the allotted time before your particular submission. What we would like to do is talk about today some of the approaches that you can have as you put your GUDID data submission plan together. We have seen that some submissions just sail right through. They're nice and clean, no hiccups. It goes through in a very easy, deliberate fashion. And yet there seems to be other records that are just problematic. You know, it seems like they get submitted multiple times. The FDA has some rejects, and it's just problematic that these things are tried to be put in place, and yet there's multiple rejections and there's a lot of activity trying to get it there. Today we would like to help solve some of that confusion. We're going to take a couple steps through this agenda. I'll do a quick refresher of the ReedTech company for those that have joined for the first time and would like a little bit of a background about ReedTech, the company that I work for. Secondly, we'll take another quick look at the FDA GUDID and some of the rules, the final rule around that particular rule, and just do a refresher. Some of you have probably examined some of this documentation, so it would be just a quick refresher for you. Others of you that are coming in as novice and wanting to learn a lot of material, and we understand that there's a number of Class 2 manufacturers, so you don't feel as though you're alone in that particular activity. I'll go through that, and it'll be a good platform. I don't want to take the time to dig down and do a full data dump on the FDA rules. So that can be for another time or another conversation. Today we'd like to then move on to some of the timely GUDID submission activities and methodologies that you might look at and most importantly, take a look at some of the experience that these Class 3 and Class 2 manufacturers that have implants, life-supporting and life-sustaining devices, what have they learned by making a submission to the FDA? We'll take a quick look at the end for a submission solution overview that ReedTech offers. I have a number of reference documents in an attachment at the end, so we'll cruise through those, but you can review those at your leisure later. And then the balance of the time is Q&A, so that we have some scripted activity in the beginning, and then Joe and I will work through some of these questions that you have, and we'll hope to get through as many of those as possible. It's very easy to send your questions in. Simply use the chat feature on the GoToWebinar. So in your bottom right panel, you'll see a little chat feature. Simply open that up and send that off to staff. Joe will pick it up and triage those and work our way through that at the end of this presentation. So with that, I'm going to launch a quick little review of ReedTech, the company that we have, that I've been working with for about 11 years now. The company is over 50 years experience working in the life science, working in the content and life cycle management. So it was founded back in 1961. We're part of a larger company, LexisNexis, and then in turn, Lexis is a part of Reed Elsevier, so it's basically our grandparent. Both companies very much interested in information databases and supplying solution to global customers. LexisNexis obviously focusing in on intellectual property. And here in Philadelphia headquarters area at Horsham, PA, we have over 1,000 employees. We also have an operations down near Washington, and we also have a European office in Leiden, Netherlands. One of the business activities here at ReedTech is to support the United States Patent and Trademark Office as a sole contractor in processing patents. Significant because that has given us a huge amount of expertise with databases and XML. More importantly to this conversation, we do serve the life science industry as well as a provider of regulatory data management and submission solutions. Number of associations that we're connected with there down at the bottom of this slide: ISO, Health Level 7, and GS1. I have one slide about the pharmaceutical services, and the question is, why would you include pharmaceutical services in a medical device conversation? Good question. I bring it up for just simply a couple reasons. One is that FDA, CDER and CBER and CVM in particular, have been using SPL since 2005, and that is where ReedTech launched into the life sciences arena and began working with SPL and XML. Since then, we've been very fortunate to have well over 850 global pharma customers, very small to large. So we work with companies that have global connections, very familiar with the submission of SPL for pharmaceutical labeling and all the variants of SPL. And we also do a number of submissions for well over half of our customers through the FDA, through the electronic submission gateway. All good background and credentials as we start talking about medical devices because of our experience with SPL, our experience with small to large customers and global customers as well. And we're able to leverage the experience with the electronic submission gateway. So more important to this conversation, slide 8, I'm referring to the medical device services that we have. Currently, over 100 global medical device customers, again, very small to large, and international customers as well. This obviously is a compliance activity from the FDA for all medical devices marketed in the U.S., and that obviously not only national U.S. manufacturers, but global manufacturers. Submitted well over 110,000 1,000 SPL records. Last time I looked at, that's roughly 20% of the total submitted, so we're very experienced in submitting to the FDA. We have automatic submissions. We are a 21 Part 11 compliant system and have plans to expand our services to international regulatory bodies as UDI comes on board. Okay, that completes the little profile of ReedTech. Let's move over to the FDA and just level set the conversation for what UDI is and GUDID in particular. So the Unique Device Identification Final Rule has 4 major components, and quickly it affects the label that you put on your product. If you have a product that has multiple use and is reprocessed, then you need to learn about direct marking. All of those medical device items that have a UDI on them need to submit data to the FDA, and we'll spend most of the conversation about that. And then their 4th part of the UDI regulation has to do with reporting. So there's annual reports, any adverse event reports as UDI becomes available. It's to be included in those reports, and you're to document that activity in your master files as well. I won't go into that, but you can come back to this slide and reveal some of the details about the final rule itself. I do want to mention something very significant. As you're considering your UDI methodology and system, you'll need to consider both the labeling system, how do you mark the UDI onto the product, where do the values come from, how are they maintained, who manages them, how are they allocated to the product, what particular issuing agency you have, GS1, or maybe HIBIC, or ICC BVA. There's 3 actually, 3 that you're able to select, and then how do you get on the product? So that's the upper rung in this diagram, the labeling system. And then independent of that, although there's about 12 to 15 shared fields, there's a second requirement that you submit data about your product to the FDA. That is stored in this Global Unique Identification Database, GUDID. Now, as a number of months ago, that's also made available publicly to the rest of the world in Access GUDID. So there's a second database that becomes available to the public. Some fields are redacted, but for the most part, your data records are there. 2 separate systems. Data content is a little bit different. On the label, you have 2 components, a device identifier and a production identifier. The data that you submit to the FDA only includes the device identifier and a number of other attributes. Grand total 55 submitted fields. All right, this is a very complicated slide. It's from the FDA. This is a typical label in their mind, but it's put together for illustration purposes so that you can look at some of the fields that are on the label and realize that they are migrated over to the data record that is submitted to the FDA. So we won't go into this eye chart here. It's very cluttered, but there are some significant things. Some fields are able to be carried over exactly, so it's a direct submission. Brand name, for example, you might take the brand name directly over. GMDN description may be on your label, but guess what? You're unable to use that GMDN description and tag when you submit it to the FDA. You need to come up with a code. So there's various approaches in processing the data for your label and the other activity processing the data for the FDA GUDID submission. For a quick reference, I put together 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 categories. Data values that are submitted to the FDA. So there's identification of the product itself, identification of the labeler, number of fields related to regulatory content, some information about the packaging and production control, and then there's a whole host of characteristics about your product. Some of these are Boolean, true and false, yes or no type of things. Others are values that you fill in. In other cases, they're from a controlled vocabulary. So the FDA refers to these as list of values. So they'll have a predefined list of values that you need to select from as you describe your product. 55 fields are submitted. 7 are derived and populated by the FDA, so they do a lookup based on what you sent to them. So a grand total of 62 fields would be found in the FDA GUDID. What about a timeline? So most of the audience, I would believe, are Class 2 manufacturers, and we see that we're pretty much in the middle of the allotted time frame. And one of my associates here put together a quick calculation, came up with 200 working days from now to September 24th, 2016. That is the date that Class 2 manufacturers need to have UDI on their label and also had the data sent to the FDA.
Gary, I'm going to interject.
There's a little bit of a challenge here.
JD asked a question about slide 12. Could you go back there for a sec?
Sure.
JD asks, could you indicate which items are mandatory and which are optional? As an example, our medical instrument is not single-use. Therefore, we presume that the single-use logo would not be required, correct? How about the others? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good. So again, this is an FDA illustrative label. Not all these fields would be required. Obviously, a keep dry, and in particular, Joe, you had mentioned the question that came up about single-use down here. Some of these icons are not required, and they're only applicable if it's appropriate for your particular product. So some are required, so the manufacturer needs to be identified. Obviously, this UDI in a human readable format and in an AIDC format needs to be there. Most companies elect to use a barcode or a 2D barcode, a single or a 2D barcode, and obviously description and so on. So I don't think we have time to evaluate each of these individual fields, but there are some guidances about what has to be on the label, and then appropriate, there's some additional things that would be necessary. So hopefully that answers that question.
It does. Let me squeak in slide 13. Lori asks, is there a difference between using true and false versus yes and no?
That's a good question. So this is one of those subtle format issues. When the data is sent to the FDA, the actual requirement of the FDA is a lowercase true and a lowercase false. So when you're working inside a system collecting that Boolean field, depending on what system you have, you may be using yes and no, you may be using a 1 or a 0, you may be using a Y or an N or a T or an F. Ultimately, the system that generates the messaging to the FDA needs to use lowercase true and lowercase false. All righty?
Yep, I'm just shaking my head on behalf of all of your guests, how complex this is. Go on.
Yeah, there are some nuances. I wanted to show this, Joe, and it's good for the audience to realize that what we have experienced for the Class 3 submission volume was relatively very low. A couple months ago, we completed, or industry completed, a number of submissions for the implants, life-sustaining, life-supporting, and that was literally about 10 times more submissions. And the FDA was extremely overloaded, had some problems in processing data. So there are some things about keeping up with the submission load as well as the help desk activity that you might want to consider as you plan for next year. When, look at this, it's expected to at least double what was submitted in September of this year. So that could be a huge volume and load, and that is something that we're going to drop into the lessons learned as we put that together at the end here to submit early to avoid some of this overloads that were experienced and timings. For example, we were seeing some times that were normally 12 minutes for acknowledgement 3 to be returned, and that was extended up to 3 days just prior to the compliance date. So that can be problematic, something you want to consider. All right.
I know I'm being very talkative today, sorry Gary, but if I'm not mistaken, based on your last slide, ReedTech itself processed 1 in 3 UDI submissions so far?
Well, as of today, it's about 20%.
Wow.
So there was significant volume that flowed through our system, yes. All right. We do have some documents available. I'll just do a quick little reference. This is not a commercial, but this is a place where you can find some very good background information. When Joe's make these slides available, you can click to this submission guide. It's targeted for the Class 2 manufacturers. You might want to go through that and read that as good background information. There is some more discussion that would like to go into, and I'm going to highlight some of the methodologies and steps that you would need to go through to put a GUDID submission system in place. And I've identified 5 particular steps: UDI prep, GUDID system prep, GUDID data prep, submit the data, and maintenance. We'll talk a little bit more about these. Won't go into a lot of detail because we want to talk about some of the lessons learned and then reserve sufficient amount of time for Q&A at the end. But as you are considering your UDI response, first step would be to create a governance team, and this will probably be a cross-functional team. We have seen a number of members from regulatory, operations, legal, marketing, sales, finance, and product management, definitely, all be involved in UDI because it just touches everywhere, the identification of the product and the compliance of that particular UDI and getting it all in place. It just permeates the company. So putting that governance team together and evaluating your core data set, make sure you do some homework and read about the requirements. You may qualify for some extensions and some exemptions, so you certainly want to explore that and see if that is applicable to your product inventory and put a plan together. Step 2 then is to concentrate on GUDID system. And I have an additional slide here to develop this particular topic. But basically, you want to look at some of the options and then create necessary accounts. So all medical device manufacturers will need to create an FDA account. If you're using SPL as an electronic submission methodology, then an electronic submission gateway would also need to be created. Then collecting your data. This is actually probably your longest and most challenging aspect of getting the data together, normalizing it, validating it, cleansing it, finding it, because we have, over the last couple years, found that many companies don't have this data set all together. It's a number of diverse silos and repositories. Submitting the data, doing your acknowledgments, processing back from the FDA, and then unfortunately, yeah, go ahead and party, but you can't forget. You need to come back to UDI the next morning, and this is an ongoing maintenance type of activity. So as changes are made, as new products are released, you will need to look at keeping that data current. If actually a product goes off market, you actually need to report that to the FDA in the GUDID. And the last item there, prepare for international UDI submissions. For those companies in the audience that are submitting or marketing their product globally outside the U.S., keep an eye on some of the regulatory activities in non-U.S. Outside the FDA. There's a lot of momentum right now. There's a lot of discussion, and I would imagine in next coming year or two, you will start to see mandates that will be applicable for other regions outside U.S. So I mentioned we had a couple, or I had a couple more slides about the submission method, and here is one of the slides in a graphic form that shows some of your options. You are able to collect the data and do a manual entry through the FDA GUDID web interface. So this incurs typing your data in. It does validation for you. It does incur labor. And from what we have seen, those companies that elect to do this realize that there are some typos and mistakes, so they usually have a second set of eyes look at that data, so a quality check on top of the data entry is typically done. The other three options in the lower rungs all use electronic submission methods using structured product labeling document format. This happens to be an XML standard put in place by Health Level 7 that the FDA has adopted and identified how data needs to be put into this particular data format. The beauty of that, one of the powerful aspects of using SPL is that you can build the data electronically, submit it electronically. So from once you have data in place and nice and clean, there's no problem in getting the data to the FDA for the most part. You're using electronic methods, and it's more applicable to higher volumes. So when you have 50 or 100 or so, it may be reasonable to just use the manual entry, although I will say we have a couple clients that have less than 10 records to submit, and we're glad to help them do that and answer questions for them. But as you get 100 or so, you might want to start looking at using electronic database and submitting the data electronically. Number of reasons for that. One is the processing is faster, it's more applicable to high volume, and as you look at submissions outside the U.S., you're able to leverage that one-time data entry and expand it for other submissions, let's say to EU or the Health Canada or Australia, other regions about the world. It's certainly much more powerful to leverage that particular entry to the FDA. There's no intent of the FDA to share that data, so it would appear to be, if you're using manual entry, you'd have to do manual entry to the FDA, and then manual entry to Health Canada, manual entry to EU, and so on. The three lower methods, just quickly describe those. The first one here is buying, building, or upgrading software that you may have inside your own firewall. So the number of companies expand capability, add modules. You can actually build it. We know of a couple companies that have embarked on trying to build a solution and commercially available. The second SPL solution is very much like the first. It's still a piece of software. Major difference is that this is a software as a service, meaning that it's hosted outside of your firewall, and your connection is by way of login, high secure connection to a software as a service, and you're able to leverage the technology and the platform with multiple other tenants. And the benefit there is that you're able to see less cost type of a solution because it's shared with many other companies. Here you have the burden all on yourself to support that full load of software, do updates, maintenance, validation, and so on. The third leg I'll quickly describe is a pure outsource model. You hand the data off to some, basically a black hole, and that black hole then goes off and builds the SPL record. This might be a service that is put together and controlling all the reports and processing the data building SPO and submitting it. Just for reference, ReedTech offers the second, or the bottom two rungs here, hosted software service and a full pure outsource service. I won't spend time on this, so you can come back to that. If you are still considering what method to go with, these are the four methods that I just described on the left-hand side. Number of comments and compares and contrasts type of attributes about each of those. There's not one particular methodology that is universal and good for everyone. You need to look at your particular skill set, your direction, your volume, and make some decisions about this. You can take a look at that after the seminar. All right, so lessons learned. Very good. So this is the session that we want to spend, or this is the section that we want to spend a little bit more time with. And I did not do a whole lot of graphical colors and everything. I pretty much charted these items on a, black and white, or here it's light blue and dark blue. But the section that we're going to take a look at, the next 3 slides, are pretty much, here's the raw facts. Without a whole lot of hubbub, we'll just go through and take a look at some of these mistakes and what our comments are. In some cases, the FDA comments. Some of these have been reported by the FDA. Others are ones that we have experienced. But let's start just knocking these out. This is the raw data, and here's the mistakes to avoid. Very first one up there, incorrect data value. This is actually very tough to identify. So as you collect data from your source, if there's manual data collection, there may be typos, transposed values. In some cases, there may not be a value available, so it might be omitted. All of these things are problematic eventually, and the FDA wants high-quality data. I'm sure you want high-quality data to be reported in this public database. So the comment here is to perform a quality check. Nothing too significant there, but it is very challenging. It looks easy, just go find the data and record it. You'll find that might be a little bit of a problem. All right, number 2, incorrect data format. So many times, and this, I'll use the example that we talked about earlier, is that you'll find the data, but it's not in the correct data format. So true and false may not be true, in the Boolean value may not be true and false in your data system. It might be a yes or no, and you have many other systems dependent on that particular format. So the intent is not to try to change that, because now you disrupt everything else. So having a system that's flexible to leave that in place and be able to work with that and extract it and then transform it is something that you would like to take a look at if you have that scenario. And in many cases, there are list of values. Again, these list of values need to be matched up exactly, letter to letter, for what the FDA requires in a controlled vocabulary. So again, that's a little bit of problematic if you have any of the discrepancies. Number 3, include the PI in the GUDID submission. This is something that you do not want to do. So the FDA is not recording all your expiration dates, your serial numbers, your batch numbers, your manufacturing dates, those type of dates. The actual values of those are not reported. And we get numerous questions by those starting to go down this UDI trail about that. There are some fields in the record that talk about these production controls, but they're simply yes or no. Do you make use of a batch number for process control? Do you make use of a serial number? And that's yes or no. The actual serial number is not recorded, so just keep that in mind. This happens, number 4 happens quite frequently, where there's a whole bunch of direct marking DIs and more commonly packaged device identifiers. If you put your product in a pouch and you put 10 pouches in a box and you put 25 boxes in a carton and then you ship it, keeping track of all those device identifiers and making sure they're associated to the base product. Sounds easy, but we have seen that this could be challenging. So check those DI records to make sure that they're all associated to the basic product that you have identified. Number 5 is pretty straightforward. If you're using it, the GS1, G10 issuing code, then you know that there's a parenthesis 01 close parenthesis in the beginning of the presentation on your label. That is not to be included in the submission to the FDA. That's considered an application identifier. It's not required. In same fashion, there's a plus sign at the prefix of a HIVIC type of identifier. Again, that is left off. Both of those methodologies, both of those issuing agencies have check digits. And you want to run your algorithm to define the check digit after all the finalization is done on that particular number. So if you're changing the packet or the indicator digit on the front end, or if you're changing an item number, that could affect or would affect the check digit. The FDA actually does exercise check digit validation. So let's check that up front and avoid those errors down the road. A number of customers have asked about finding their listing number. And it might be that the person that's building the record is not familiar with what happened to their 510K documentation or their PMA documentation. The FDA assigns that at your time of application, so you're going to have to dig around a little bit to find that listing number. GMDN codes. You want to check the GMDN code, and again, it's one of those things that's been sitting around, not really used, but maybe referred to every once in a while. And more than once, we have seen manufacturers find that their GMDN codes of 3 years ago, it has now been made obsolete. So they submit the GMDN code, and there's a note down there at the bottom where one code is usually sufficient, and the FDA receives updates from GMDN Association twice a month. And then they try to get that loaded as soon as possible. So that means a couple things. One is their database is fresh, relatively fresh, and it does have obsoletes in it. So you might find that you get a rejection based on the fact that your GMDN code for your product, if you're making, let's say, a scalpel, and there's a 5-digit number for that code or for that scalpel, it may no longer be used. It's more granular now, for example. There's one other issue here. In the event that you have to create a brand new GMDN code and you get confirmation from GMDN that this agency now has that number in place, but it could be a couple weeks before the FDA knows about it. So see that twice a week update? You might fall into that category, and now you're trying to submit a code that the FDA doesn't know about quite yet. So there's some nuances here about GMDN codes. And then the last one on this slide, an incorrect donation ID number flag. So this is set up for those human tissue products. You set that flag to be yes if that product falls, or your device falls into that particular category. But you'll find that this is only for ICC BBA device identifiers. So don't try to mix and match that if you're using other type of identifiers. Gary? Yes, sir.
First, I don't know if you can hear the rounds of applause all over the world. This was a great slide. Lynn asks, is number 4 a pull-down association? Won't each of the packaging levels have unique device identifiers?
Yes. So what we have found is that in some systems that manufacturers have, they keep track of SKUs. And they would have a SKU or a device identifier for each packaging level, and they have a number of fields associated with that record. But somewhere you need to associate the fact that your let's say your IV pump has been put into a box, and now there's 2 boxes into a carton, that sort of thing. So relating those into a configuration is important, because at time of submission there's a single record that includes the base product and any and all package configurations related to that base product. So the difference is that in a manufacturing system, you might be treating these device identifiers as individual records, whereas the FDA wants the association all tied back to a particular base product. Some companies in that process tend to mix up the SKU numbers, and then they start to make duplicate device submissions, and that's not going to work out for them.
If you don't mind, let's stay on that for just a second, because a number of questions came up that are relevant to this particular slide. Patrick also has a question about number 4. Perhaps you've just answered it. Is it easier to just assign the DM device identifiers now, even though they aren't required, in order to have this make more sense?
Well, this is a very specific question about direct marking device identifiers. Many products do not need to have a device identifier for the direct marking. So it's only those devices that are reprocessed and used multiple times. So in between a patient, there's a clean and a disinfectant activity. That's the reprocess. And they're used from, Joe, it might be used on you, and then it's cleaned up and then used on me, and then it's cleaned up and used on a third party. So that particular device that falls into that category will have to use a direct mark DI.
So Wim asks how to deal with direct marking data in 2016 GUDID upload while DM due date is 2018. Should we just leave it out?
Oh, I see what is going on. So I'm going to back up to that. So this particular question has to do with, in 2016, you'll need to report those device identifiers, and for direct marking, you have 2 years later to actually have that device identifier marked on the product. So yes, it makes good sense to allocate that direct marketing DI and record it, even though it may be 2 years later before it actually shows up on the manufactured product. So just make sure that your device is direct marking qualified. Single-use products don't need to go down this road at all.
Okay, stay on that slide. Barn asks, could you clarify the difference between labels and packages of Class 2 medical devices under September 2016 UDI and direct marked in 2018? What is the difference between a label and directly marked?
So that's a good question. So putting a label in the product is intended to last at least to the time of administration, and most importantly for those single-use products. So if I receive a Band-Aid, I need to see that that Band-Aid has a device identifier on it until I actually put it on and apply it to use. Direct marking is a added requirement over and above that, where if that product is used over and over again, most likely the original package is long gone, and now the FDA would like that device to be identified in the event there's an adverse event, you know, a year after it was used on the first patient. So direct marking is in addition to the labeling requirement. Some companies have put together a very durable label and mark their product appropriately to satisfy both UDI requirements. So identifying the product and taking care of the direct marking by using a very durable label itself. So hopefully that answers that question.
I have a whole bunch on GMDN codes. Maybe I'll let you go back to your slides and we'll come back to you later.
I'm sorry, you did have one for GMDN, or we're going to
We
pick that
have
up?
3 for GMDN. Do you want me to hold off?
Yeah, let's go through the other list, and but hold that. We'll definitely come back to it.
Okay.
So there's a second slide for data related. I'll quickly walk through these. I think we kind of get the idea of what these are all about. And we had talked a little bit already about package configuration and getting the count correct when you go to a new package level and the volume is greater than 1, you need to assign a new device identifier. So perhaps your leading indicator digit was a 0 for your base product, and now that product goes into a pouch and it has a 1 in the front of it, and you might put 10 pouches into a carton, and now it has a 2 in front of it. So you will have to create unique device identifiers at each package level. There's a lot of confusion about the scenario where one device is put into a single package. So let's say it's a single, let's make it easy, single tongue depressor inside a pouch. And the FDA has made it clear that when you do one product in one package, you need to use the very same device identifier for both of those items, so the base product applies. And there's no need to report that level to the FDA. It's only when you get to a second level of packaging where you put multiple devices into that package, then you report that to the FDA and create a unique device identifier. The number 11 there is one of the FDA's comments that they have found that for the model and version field, many people use the word model or a V or ver or version, whatever, some text field in addition to the actual identifier. For sorting and a structured type of database, none of those things are required. Just put the actual model number itself or the version number. For example, like ABC-24, if that's your model number. No reason to put the text in front of it. And then another comment from the FDA, some records leave the device description field blank, even though it is optional. The FDA would like some kind of a description in there so the end user is able to better identify the product. And they recommend that if you don't have a good description, that you could use the approved and cleared indication for use that came back on that is part of your application. And the last one I'll quickly talk about here is, again, an FDA reference where some manufacturers use a clinical relevant size description field. That's a mouthful. It's really just a wide open text field, and they're recording the fact that this might be 10 millimeters long, and yet there are dedicated fields for each of those sub-elements, so that the size type of length and a value of 10 in the unit of millimeters have dedicated fields, and the FDA would like, again, to have that broken apart so that it becomes structured and sortable. I have one more slide, Joe, on submission-related mistakes, and then I think we'll kind of wrap this formal presentation up and go into the Q&A directly. Submission-related mistakes. Number one there, make sure that the application to the FDA has your correct information. Certainly your label and DUNS number needs to be correct, and if you're using SPL, you'll need to include a third-party submitter. If you're using a third-party submitter, make sure those are right. And we have seen actually some errors in processing. For whatever reason, when we try to make submissions, even though the application is correct, the FDA had a little slip up in setting up the account, and it needs to be tested and verified so that all of the information that is part of the application is correct and that the FDA have properly implemented that particular setup. Then there's this issue of duplicate submissions. So you'll get a reject back if your identifier is the same in the SPL. There's some fields in there that identify the actual electronic submission and a duplicate value. There is a concept of hung submissions. That's really our term. I'm not sure the FDA uses that. But this is a scenario, and we have seen it hundreds of times, where we'll submit data to the FDA and never hear back. So there won't be any acknowledgement, and whether it's an acknowledgement 2 or whether it's acknowledgement 3. And that happens for various reasons, as I understand it. There could be a reset at the FDA, so a system reset if they're doing some upgrades, if there's some queuing operations, if something's overloaded. And in some cases, we put a help desk ticket in, and all of a sudden, boom, it magically appears, and we get the acknowledgement. Other times, the response is, go ahead and resubmit. It's better to just get a fresh entry. So bottom line is, don't assume that your submission goes through without a hitch. There are some very important follow-ups that need to be done on the acknowledgments coming back from the FDA to verify the fact that you have actually submitted. So one, unfortunately, cannot just hit the submit button and then turn around and party. Well, you can do that as well, but the next day you ought to check to see that the actual submission was received and validated. The other item I'll mention here, number 4, this is actually very problematic. Many customers have this data quality issue, and they don't review the data prior to the end of the grace period at the FDA. And then once this data now becomes published in the final state, there's about 15 fields that are unable to be edited. And you really have to retire that record or plead your case to the FDA, and I haven't seen too many of those successful pleads, where that record now is published and it's out there. And if you had made a mistake, either a simple typo or a value's wrong, you would have to generate a brand new device identifier to replace that record. So that has huge impacts in your system by duplicating, that particular product with a new DI. Please take a close look at that. Make sure that the data that you submit is what you want to publish, especially these fields that are unable to be edited. Number 5 has to do with questions that you might have to the FDA about a particular record, and you submit a help desk ticket. The FDA creates something called a core ID. I won't go into that, but it's an identifier, a unique identifier for that particular submission, and the FDA would like you to keep track of that. That comes back to you as part of this acknowledgement, and a good system that you look at would definitely track that. And the last parting shot here is submitting close to the compliance state. I hope that the FDA has learned and cranked up their capability for the next round, next September. We have seen, huge delays, a lot of traffic right around the compliance date. The last 2 weeks are starting to get extremely busy. All right, that completes some of the formal listing of the lessons learned. One quick sentence about our solution. On the left is a device manufacturer with the data in various systems, and this is very typical of a software as a service solution or an outsourced model, where that data then is sent to the blue system, number of steps along the way to make sure it's valid, version controlled. This system would need to be 21 Part 11 compliant, and then the record submitted to the FDA, acknowledgments coming back, and so on. Won't take the time to do that. I'd prefer to get some Q&A knocked out. And here's some of the benefits. Our system, simple, cost-effective, very or minimally intrusive into your connections and to your systems, and it's flexible, saves a lot of time when you're looking at the higher volumes. The slide presentation that Joe will make available to you, here's some contact information. Haley, Mike, Mark, Andrew are ready to talk to you about your particular scenario. And the reference material, there's some blogs that you can connect to. Again, this is very good background information off of our website. Here's some links, again, available through our website. Couple or multiple links to the FDA, very good information. If you're new to this particular topic, I highly recommend the small entity compliance guidance. Look for that. Nice 20-page synopsis of the FDA rules. For those companies that are marketing outside the U.S., keep an eye on Medical Device Regulatory Forum. We have a comparison of the fields that the FDA requires and expected European Commission fields and so on. And this is really busy, but it's a glossary. We used a lot of acronyms, so you might want to come back here if you're new to this particular topic. And Joe, let's move on to Q&A.
Well, brace yourself. We have a regular battery, and based on just your appendices of, and you can read this and you could read that, I'm thinking to myself, well, you could just call Gary. Because, wow, this stuff, I mean, this is my 6th webinar with you, and it's mind-spinning. To those of you on the phone, and about 95% of the folks who logged in are still on an hour in, I recognize some of you have a hard stop. We are recording. We are going to stay on for another half hour. If you need to leave, we are not offended. We will get a transcript in short order and the slides and the replay. And now I'm going to hit you with a half dozen GMDN questions, okay?
Sure. Let's take it away.
Yes, let's start with the easiest ones. Mark and Avi ask, is the GMDN description required? Is it compulsory? What if your product does not have a GMDN code yet?
All right, very good questions. So when you are submitting by way of SPL, the only field that is submitted is the actual GMDN code, and we'll talk about one alternative in a second. The actual description and the term itself are two of the fields that the FDA does a lookup because they have access to the GMDN dictionary, and they do a lookup based on the submitted code and provide that as part of their database. So only the GMDN code is submitted for the first part of that answer. The other thing I'll mention is the FDA had regulations to make sure that you could provide this information at no cost. GMDN does require a subscription. It's a standards organization. Membership does have a little bit of a charge so that you can go in and get GMDN codes. So as an alternative, the FDA has made available a 4 alpha code that relates to each one of the 5-digit number GMDN codes. I understand it's a little confusing, but basically the FDA has their own set. That set is publicly available through the FDA Web GUDID interface. So you could technically search for your particular product description, find the FDA code, and submit that at no charge. Or you could get a subscription to the GMDN agency and use their particular numeric code. One last thought on GMDN. You will need to come up with some identifier, and the FDA has indicated one is usually sufficient, but in some cases you're able to submit more. It is a required field, and you're able to search and find something that best represents your product. We have seen some customers come back and say, you know what, I looked and looked and looked, and I don't find my product in the list. The FDA's answer is use the best fit and just go with it. Go ahead, Joe.
I'm going to kind of mash together kind of the questions around this because they have a lot of overlap. JD says, we're foreign. He's in Canada. Does he need one? I think the answer there is yes, based on what you just said. Dan asks, FDA has a temporary alternate to GMDN codes. How long can we use that? And Matthew asks, if a GMDN code becomes obsolete, how long do we have to update it?
Two good questions there. As to the FDA's providing this alternative code and how long they expect to do that, the FDA has made no intent that this would be turned off or discontinued. So that question was asked of the FDA, and although they kind of presented it as a temporary measure initially, I think they're committed to it because of the legal aspect of a no-cost solution, and therefore, when asked, the FDA says we have no intention of dismissing the FDA alpha code. Let's see, what was the other part of that? How long was going to be?
If it becomes, if the GMDN code becomes obsolete, how long do we have to update it?
Yes, very good. So obsolete. So this happens immediately. So upon the FDA's 2-week update, you would need to conform to their update. So if your number is obsoleted 2 months ago, then you're submitting today, and the FDA now has that updated list from the GMDN that shows your GMDN code obsolete. You'll be refused. So it's a very instantaneous type of an update at a 2-week time phase, and you will need to comply to current GMDN code. So there's no grace period for having an obsolete code for a year.
Okay. Other topics. First, a couple of people left and said, thank you, great presentation, very informative. Marilyn asks, is it possible to do your submission in phases? We have hundreds of products, and Marilyn, you have my sympathy.
The answer to that is yes. So as you have individual products where the full record is complete, you will have to submit complete records to the FDA, but you can take your inventory of 10,000 and just work on a product family initially and just piecemeal it out one at a time, or groups of 10 or 1,000, whatever is most convenient.
Lynn asks, the FDA has provided an Excel file for the attributes. Can you go over just how to use this, as the file is very confusing?
Say the FDA has provided an Excel file?
Yes.
So we've actually heard some other companies mention that. We have a version that we use, and well, actually we've received some comments that some companies prefer ours over the FDA's.
Is that something you'll be providing for folks, or is it something that they need to pay for?
Yeah, that's not a paid service. You are able to make a connection to our sales individuals at the end of the slide. You saw the contacts there. Go ahead, connect up with them, and they'll be able to make a template available to you.
Lynn also asks, please explain how you describe a package configuration in the description field. Shall I ask again?
No, I wanted to think about that to make sure I understood what was going on there. So in a device description field, and there's a couple description fields, that's why it was a little confusing to me. The device description field is for the base product. So you can say this is a IV pump, and model 523 or whatever, with servicing this type of application. Then there's also a text field about the actual product, so or about the packaging level. So if your packaging level has a box, and there is a pure text field where you can, and it's optional, you can describe the box and say the box has 2 devices packaged inside a sterile container. So you can use that. Both of those are optional. The FDA really does want you to include, going to the package now, the device identifier, and the fact that that level of a box contains a quantity of 5 base products, and most importantly, what is the unique device identifier for that box level. So there's a triplet of a bit of information that is required for every packaging field: the quantity, the device identifier, and the level. So the information that needs to be there needs to be submitted, and you can have an optional text field describing your product. or at a packaging level.
Marilyn asks.
So hopefully that answered that.
I'll continue. Marilyn asks, when I try to open a GUDID account, an automated message informs me FDA is not accepting applications for anything but Class 3 devices at this time. Would you have any information on when they will open it up to Class 2?
Yes, that's a great question. January 1, 2016 will be the first date that the FDA allows Class 2 product manufacturers to create an account. So the way this works is if you have a higher risk product, maybe you manufacture Class 3 and Class 2. Well, for Class 3 you already were able to create an account, and you could submit the rest of your inventory, including Class 2s and Class 1s if you really wanted to. But if your most risky product is a Class 2, and it's not an implant, life-sustaining, or life-supporting, then you'll need to wait till after the first of the year to have an account set up. The FDA does recommend that you start some of those early steps that we had described today, preparing your data. There's a lot of activity that you can work on while you wait for the FDA to open up their front doors.
Jim asks, how do you enter storage conditions, humidity, and temperature?
So very good. I knew this might come up sooner or later, but let's talk about this, storage conditions. There is, again, a 3-field set, a data set that describe storage conditions. And you can have multiple data sets. So let's just talk about this for a second. Let's say your product has a limitation on temperature, and it might be a low value of, say, 20 degrees C, and that's the minimum. And you might also have a high value of 50 degrees C. So you can put in both the 20 as a low value, the 50 as the high, and then the unit of measure is centigrade, let's say. So temperature, 20 is the min, 50 is the max, and the unit of centigrade. Those 4. Excuse me, I said 3 earlier, I meant to say 4. In addition to that, you might have some humidity requirements. So you would repeat these very same fields, but now the concept, the type of control would be on humidity. And again, maybe you have a maximum humidity of 90%. You could leave off the minimum and just put 90 as the high, and value unit would be percent. So you are able to include, there's presentations available and list of values available for temperature, pressure, and atmospheric temperature, pressure, and humidity, excuse me. And then if you have something that is outside of that, let's say it should not be exposed to direct sunlight, that comes into a special dedicated field called a text field, and you can put that information in as well. That's independent of the temperature, humidity, and pressure that we had just talked about. Next one.
Patrick has a few. How should we handle package assemblies, that is base unit, that include more than one medical device?
So this brings up, and again, I will do a quick review of this. I do ask that they go back to some of the guidance and look to some of the discussion that the FDA has on unit of use. So that particular term, unit of use, refers to, and the classic example is adhesive bandages in a box. So if you have a special scenario, and this is one of those exceptions that we talked about, where you have multiple items, let's say 10 Band-Aids, they're all the same version, they are intended to stay in the Band-Aid box until the time of use. So you meet all these qualifications, and it's a single-use product. Great. Now what you're able to do is make use of an exception that says you do not have to put a device identifier on each individual Band-Aid in the box. You only need to put a device identifier on the assembly, the box of Band-Aids. So hopefully that makes sense. I will mention as you start to get into the nuance there that the FDA does like to, or does require, something called a virtual device identifier. So you would allocate a number for that individual use item, the Band-Aid, and record that with the FDA, but you do not need to put that device identifier on the individual Band-Aid. The reason for the virtual device identifier is to allocate at the end use, say a pharmacy or hospitals using these, and they administer at the individual level. So they consume, 5 of a box of 10. The intent is to be able to track that individual usage down at the granular level. So next one there, Joe.
Is simple cleaning, such as wipe down with an alcohol swab, considered reprocessing?
I recommend, and again, I thought this would come up as well. So the FDA has actually put out a guidance document specifically about the qualifications for direct marking, which are multiple use and reprocessing. And they define reprocessing as cleaning with a disinfectant or an equivalent. So a simple wipe down is not what the FDA means by reprocessing. If it's cleaned and disinfected, and now you qualify for reprocessing. So I do refer you to go to the FDA website and read this particular document under UDI resources and get a little bit better definitions. The time allowed here, we can't go much deeper than that.
Luce asks, could you please advise how UDI and GUDID requirements specifically apply to standalone software medical devices?
Well, let's first make sure we understand what we're referring to. If your device has internal software or firmware embedded in as a subcomponent, that's not what we're talking about here. In this scenario, the software itself is considered a medical device and has approval in a marketing application. So there might be a 510K connected with it, for example. In that scenario, UDI does apply. There's some special provisions for software as a device, and you will need to put a device identifier either in the help box or an opening screen on that piece of software. There are some rules about identifying the software. If it's physically packaged in a CD and delivered, then that package needs to have the UDI on it. If it's a downloaded type of piece of software, that obviously does not apply, and the marking inside the software when you run it is sufficient. So there are some special exceptions. If you want to dig deeper, I'd refer you to the FDA's section on software as a device.
Donna and Laura ask, how does FDA define a kit? I've asked them to answer the question, and they have not.
Yeah, kits are problematic. So a kit is an assembly of multiple components that could be multiple devices. It could be devices and some drugs, but it does have multiple components. And the kit needs to have a predefined bill of material and a set quantity that's delivered in a set fashion. So if you have a kit, let's say it's, I don't know, 10 items of A and 2 items of B, and it's always shipped out that way and ordered that way, then you qualify as this kit. The beauty of the kit exception, and you want to read about it because there are some advantages, UDI is not required on the individual components that make up the kit. The assembled kit needs to have a UDI connected with it, and that assembled entity is what gets recorded with the FDA. So those scenarios where you might have multiple combinations of components that make up kits, this greatly minimizes your UDI documentation and efforts if you simply work at the kit level. So you, again, can read some details about that, but it's a collection of individual devices.
I suspect that you've kind of answered this, and I suspect that Marilyn and Donald should talk to you afterward because there's a lot of confusion about kits and accessories. So I'll read these and say I think I've addressed that enough if you feel you have. Donald says, what if it's a kit like a vascular catheter and the special introducer, each sold separately and both in a specific kit, ? New product number for the kit, ? And Marilyn says, do you have to report product accessories?
So let's talk about the kit and the scenario where some of these kits are sold separately. Now that brings a new wrinkle into play. As the fact that the kit is sold separately, it would need, that individual component would need to have its own unique DI. When it's assembled in a kit, that assembly needs to have a different UDI. Both of those items are recorded to the FDA. The other scenario that we were talking about there are accessories. So we've heard that the FDA is very, or put out warnings about the use of the word accessories. Accessories do need to be recorded with the UDI and marked as such, and also sent to the FDA and recorded to the FDA. If you have some things that are replaceable components, let's say Part B fails in your assembly and now you ship a replacement Part B out, it still maintains the same functionality, identification, and so on, but it's a replacement part of a broken piece. In that case, that replacement that is sent out does not need to have a UDI. So that would not be considered an accessory. Spare parts are not in that category. But if you have sold like 2 or 3 additional support pieces that are used into a system and optionally ordered and delivered, then those accessory needs to have UDI. So let's try another one.
Okay, again similar. Do you have to do one submission for each SKU or for each unit? From Julie.
The word unit brings a little bit of caution. So we talked earlier about unit of use, and you do not need to make a submission for each unit of use. But I think what she was referring to, every base product needs to have a submission, an individual record, so identifying, you might have 10,000 items that you market. Each of those 10,000 medical devices would need to have a UDI and recorded with the FDA. I will mention that sometimes the conversation gets a little cluttered and confused because the FDA record at the GUDID also includes the packages associated with that base product. So you might have a SKU count of 20 in your inventory, but 5 of those SKUs are really package levels of a base product. So that would reduce your overall submissions to the FDA. All those device identifiers are ultimately in the system, but organized in a different, in a structure by record. Next one.
Sean asks, do you have to apply for an ESG account and GUDID account if the intention is to submit using the web interface?
So all medical device manufacturers will need to have a FDA GUDID account, and that's a submission, pretty straightforward process. Actually, if you work with us, we have some guidance documents, some samples about how you go about filling that in. If you make manual entry using the web GUDID, you do not need to have an electronic submission gateway, ESG account. But if you're submitting by way of electronic SPL, electronic format using SPL messaging, yes, you will need to create an electronic submission gateway. So I'll just mention that some companies, such as ours, as part of our solution set, we include a very high-speed, what's referred to as an AS2 type computer-to-computer connection with the FDA. And that is a shared resource that is at no additional charge to our clients. So you want to talk very specifically about your solution provider. We, as an example, include that at no additional charge, and you basically submit, and the data gets submitted to both the pre-production and the production environments at the FDA. Other companies don't know their details, but they may charge for that additional submission service. If you do it on your own, obviously you will need to connect up. There's only one electronic submission gateway that the FDA provides. So if you're submitting some adverse events, for example, medical device adverse events to the electronic submission gateway, it's really the same gateway, but now you need to flag the records to go to different areas inside the gateway.
Adam asks, how does servicing a device impact the device identifier? If a component is upgraded, will the DI change, or is it set and fixed during manufacturing?
So that's a very good point. And to help understand the answer, you want to think about what's the FDA and the patient's approach to this. So if I have a device and something breaks in it, and now a component is sent out and or serviced, and it's an exact replacement, so I'm back at the same virtual model and version that I was originally, then there's no change. No activity needs to be done. But in the event that component causes the device to be identified as a new model or new version, and it's significantly different in functionality, and the manufacturer deems that to be significant enough to be a new model, then you do need to put a new UDI on that particular product. So the intent, what happens as a result of that, is if I have an adverse event with the product before the update occurred, you'd be able to look at the data and associate that event with that particular model and version. If after the update there's an adverse event that's recorded, now Model 2, where it was Model 1 originally, Model 2 has a problem. So being able to decipher that is very important. It really goes down to the manufacturer's determination of what constitutes a model and a version change. And the FDA's hands-off on this. They did allow the manufacturer to determine what constitutes a model or version. But in the event a new model and version is generated, a new UDI needs to be created and associated with that new model.
We're on the warning track, 5 minutes left, and well more than 5 minutes worth of questions.
All right, let it rip.
Carrie asks, the devices we are marketing are reusable surgical instruments. So how do we label those without DM? Do we just need to enter into GUDID and assign a DI, or do we also have to include a label to accompany the product as well?
So, Joe, to answer that, could you go back? Was it a reusable device?
Yes,
or was it a single use?
Reusable surgical instrument.
Okay, so let's say it's a scalpel, as an example. So the basic questions that the FDA wants you to answer: is the device reusable, and is it reprocessed? So I would expect, hopefully, the scalpel is cleaned and sterilized, so now it is in this category of being reprocessed. So that falls into that additional category of being direct marked. And direct marking can take many different forms. We have seen some areas where the actual surface is manipulated, either ball peened or etched chemically or laser etched. All types of scenarios about marking the product. In some cases, there is changes to the mold of a plastic device, for example, and the direct marking is embedded right into the surface. There's other type of activities where you can affix a label that is intended to be durable and withstand all the sterilization and life of the product and be able to, stay with the product for the life, not fall off, then you meet the intent of direct marking. Now, the FDA does, I will mention this, the FDA does allow the direct marking DI to be the same as what is referred to as the base product. So for labeling and direct marking, you can have the very same device identifier. As an option, you can have two different device identifiers. So a little bit confusing, but I would receive that scalpel, for example, in a box, and that box would have one DI. I open the box up, and oh, lo and behold, there's a different number etched into the scalpel itself. So that's all legitimate and recorded at the FDA. Let's try another one.
Steve asks, what is the relationship between FDA UDI and European IMDRF UDI proposal? We are trying not to implement this twice.
Yes, we all hope that there would be great overlap. I would ask this person then to download the slides and go to that particular slide that has the comparison of what the FDA has and what the European Commission has proposed. Certainly nothing official yet. They're at least a year and a half out before anything really gets official on the European front. A quick comment about something called IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. This is a group of, I think it's 7 to 9 regulatory bodies that get together and decide direction for the future and encourage collaboration and common rules of the road, if you will, common regulatory requirements. So there is a document from that group, the IMDRF, that defines what fields are basic in UDI and the fact that electronic submissions should make use of SPL, the Health Level 7 standard. And there's a list of a number of fields, and actually the slide, let me go quickly down to that. You'll see that the blue column here is the FDA list, and the second column in orange is what's recommended by the IMDRF. Lo and behold, the FDA did not conform, so they had a bunch of extra fields. And what we see from the EC is some conformance, and yet they have their own dedicated fields in some cases. So bottom line, there's a common core set. You would be wise to think about a solution that is expanding. So our approach is to have a core set of FDA, and then as Health Canada, EU come on board, you add additional data fields into your database, and then when it comes time for an FDA submission, you collect whatever fields are appropriate for FDA, you submit them. When you need a corresponding submission to the EC, system then builds those fields, might add a couple, might delete a couple, package it, and send it off to the portal to the EC. So hopefully there'll be a lot of common fields. We think about 80% cross usage, and yet we also know that there's going to be some regional differences. So let's try the next one.
You should expect an email from Beata Corral, who asks 5 questions, which we don't have time for, but here's the spirit of them. Do we need UDI codes for testing fixtures, loaner units, rentals when something is in repair, cables, etc.? I don't know if you have like a global answer about what about these kind of in-between situations, testing, loaning, rentals.
Yep, there are some exceptions. And again, the small entity guidance is probably a good place to get started, and then the full UI goes a little bit more detail. But things such as investigative devices, testing, actually devices that are for the national stockpile, all those are exempted. So samples would be exempted. It's really those things that go out into the marketplace. So in the event they're consumed and sold, basically the question is whether or not they are marketed to industry. And you have to watch what the actual term of marketing means and put into the marketplace. So a testing device, devices for veterinary applications, for example, are exempted. So it's best for this person to go back and read the letter of the law about those particular exceptions.
We are out of time. I'm going to add just another few minutes because Wenjing has been especially patient with me. I expect that you'll have correspondence there as well with the questions, what is the lowest DI level, and how to build the labeling hierarchy and GMDN allocation in UDI labeling. I don't expect you to have time to answer that. And a general interest in questions about packaging and how to allocate MDL numbers for reagents. So I don't know if there's anything global you can say there, but I suspect an email between you is in order.
Yeah, I think we want to go into a little bit more deeper discussions, particularly on that hurts or that particular scenario. In general, I will say that there's a base product that is very important to establish at the get-go. Are there sub-elements below the base product that qualify for unit of use? And then as you have packaging levels at higher levels, then if the quantity is greater than 2, you put 1 or 2 or more items together, then you need to assign device identifiers to those. Both GS1 and HIBIC, the more commonly used issuing agencies, have a scheme for packaging levels. So I'm just going to use G10 only because it's a little bit more popular. So at a base product level, the recommendation is that you use 0 as your package indicator digit. And then as you need additional levels, you can use 1, 2, 3, up to 8 for that particular prefix. And yet you're then able to use the very same item identifier for that family of packaging, if you will. And that's a very wise use of the G10 scheme because it maximizes the use of the individual item number, and it basically saves your item numbers for different package device itself, or a different package, I should say. So we can talk more about that if people have individual questions.
You expect many. I'm afraid that there are many that we couldn't get to today. But we will close with Sarah's question. Sarah has many Class 1 products as well. Can she submit them to GUDID at the same time, or will she have to wait until closer to the 2018 deadline?
That's an easy one. So once you get an account, say Class 2 manufacturers, that manufacturer then can submit everything in their inventory, including the Class 1.
That's a good, simple answer and a good way for us to close. Gary, you know how much I personally enjoy doing these with you, and you never fail to keep a rich pipeline of questions. This is complicated stuff, and frankly, I'm constantly amazed that you can answer all these questions.
Just let me quickly jump in. Thank you, Joe, and certainly to the Medical Devices Group for sponsoring this. This is a wonderful outlet, and it's a lot of anxious manufacturers out there that those Class 2 manufacturers needing to put something in place, and they are looking at large volumes. In some cases, they're very small companies, and yet they may not have the regulatory staff to dive into all these nuances. So there's help out there, ReedTech being one of them, Connect Up, and there's some industry groups and so on that you can refer to. And we're just glad to help out, and we are so pleased to be able to work with you again, Joe, on putting this presentation together.
In conclusion, as of this recording, December 10, 2015, you've got 200 days left, and based on what we've seen, that's not a lot of time. Gary and ReedTech, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll have the recording and slides ready for you in under 3 hours' time. Thank you.